Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back. This is season 2 of the Ex Umbris podcast. Can you believe it?
We ended on a cliffhanger.
Did we not?
Right? We're just like, I don't know, a soap opera or like Batman or something, right? At the end. We ended the school year last year on part 1 of the series, and then 2 months elapsed before we got to part 2. What an exciting suspense to leave our listeners and viewers in, I tell you.
Right.
Yeah. Welcome back, to our listeners of the Ex Umbris podcast. If you're new joining us, we are classical Catholic education in podcast form. I am Schoolman Fawcett, and I'm sitting here with
Scholarch McLarney.
We work at the world's only online Chesterton Academy. It's the Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center out of Western Canada. So if you want to know the kind of education that you get if you enroll with us, just keep watching or listening. So, when we last spoke before our respective wonderful summers, we were talking about, back when.
Back when we were...
I think you were more hirsute at the time, weren't you? You had more hair, I want to say.
Very much so, I think so.
Yeah.
We're younger and sharper, I think, now.
Yeah, our children were younger. Yours was yours even ex utero? I wanted at the time. I don't.
No, that's right.
Jerry Jr. had not yet been born.
That's right.
So yeah. And we were speaking at the time about justice. We're going to pick that up today, talking about justice in Plato as opposed to Machiavelli, the ancient philosophical conception of justice compared to the modern philosophical concept of justice. So, Dr. McLarney, you're going to take the helm on this one. I'm going to speak more in our next episode, where I kind of give my own take on Machiavelli, on the Prince, and on faith. Today we're focusing on his theory of justice. So I'm handing off the reins to you, my headmaster. So take it away. What would you like to discuss?
Thank you very much. Now, I tend to ensnare, or maybe involve students as we go along, and I think I'm going to actually open up with a few questions for you, just to test your memory. I mean, 2 months, I've even forgotten what we were talking about, so
you won't know if I give the wrong answer, really,
exactly.
Fundamentally. That's I think what I'm getting from this.
Yeah, okay, so we were talking about justice. Now, if you recall from Plato's Republic, there are interlocutors, right, with Plato, and there's Cephalus, then there's Polemarchus, his son, Cephalus the old man, then the son, and then there's Thrasymachus. Now, they each offer different takes on what justice is, and just like our last episode, leaving you on a cliffhanger, same thing with Book 1 of Plato's Republic, it kind of just leaves you on a note where you're running, okay, well, all right, fine, Plato, you've told us about Cephalus, Polemarchus and Thrasymachus, but what about you, right? What does Socrates actually think about justice? But let's revisit that. So do you recall Cephalus? Like, what is his definition of justice? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
Oh, sure. Well, let me see. It starts off with having to do with doing what? Oh gosh, it has to do with because he's thinking in a very transactional way. Right?
Paying your debts essentially.
Paying your debts,
that's right.
So
it's
very mercantile.
What you're owed, right? And that makes sense for someone who's established, a businessman and so on. You want your customers and so on to pay what they owe, and you've presumably gone through life paying your debts as well. So that's what it is. Yeah.
And he's at that stage of his life, I suppose, right?
He is, and I think we probably mentioned this last time, but he's thrown out of the room by the wrestler, by Socrates, and so with him goes convention, which is why you're going to see all sorts of interesting ideas popping up later in Plato's Republic. All right, now his son is Polemarchus the warlord, and what do you recall what he's saying? It's a very, it resonates with a political animal, perhaps. He's young, he's robust, he was making connections. Maybe he wants a future in the polis, in the political sphere.
Ooh, I don't want to conflate him with who comes after.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm afraid I will.
Well, no problem. So what he's doing is saying, well, you do good to your friends, and you harm your enemies. I mean, it totally makes sense.
That's right. Yes.
You reward the people who help you get in power, and then you kind of step on all those who oppose you, which Socrates will point out, well, there's some weaknesses with that point of view as well. And then finally there's Thrasymachus, the sophist, the doppelganger, as it were, of Socrates, who steps out, and now he's waiting in the background, and now he steps into the mix of it.
Into the ring.
Into the ring, that's right. And what does he throw out there? I don't know if you recall.
Well, basically, it's just it's might makes right. Right? It's the advantage of the stronger. is what justice is.
Justice and its rules are for suckers. It's
Which
for
is-
the gullible.
Which is not, I don't think, necessarily that far. I mean, it's really the logical conclusion of what's come before, I think. If you think of it as helping your friends and harming your enemies, ultimately, it seems to me, and I think maybe Plato's making this point, you have to end up thinking that way. That really, if you're going to follow like rules of conventions of justice, like you're the sucker, really. You need to be self-interested, and that means going beyond good and evil in some sense.
Oh, absolutely. And now, speaking of which, you're almost evoking there Nietzsche, as well as Marx will pick up on those ideas as well, not to mention Hobbes. But for, like, I think we mentioned this last time, but again, just to revisit it, with Hobbes, really, what do we want in life? It's nothing more than power, right? And for Marx, well, again, there's no rhyme or reason to justice. It's just this is the apparatus by which the ruling class maintains the means of production, essentially. And so there's no ideal, there's no ideos when it comes to justice. There's just power, brute power. Okay, good. Now, that's Hobbes and Marx, but really, I think they owe a great debt to Machiavelli, who gives us a playbook, I think, of this line of reasoning.
So, I guess, I don't have to do this in the next episode. Do we want to just talk a little bit about who Machiavelli was?
I think so. So Machiavelli, he's a 15th century Florentine who... again, for listeners, you got to remember this is back when it's Italy's not a country at all. Florence is a city-state, and the King of France invades Italy in the late 1400s, and Florence loses its independence. Now, by a few years later, that's in 1494. By 98 of that century, Florence it manages to force its foreign invaders out. And Machiavelli, he ends up working for the chancery of the reestablished Republic of Florence. And now the chief magistrate, a fellow named Sarnini, he passes legislation banning any association or public reference to the Medici family. Now, for those who know history, maybe think that might not have been the best move to make. But he not wanting this rival family to gain any power, the government of Florence at the time decides, well, let's place a bounty on all the heads of the Medici cousins. Okay. Now, unfortunately, for Machiavelli and all those in Florence, their independence does not last long enough. Now, Machiavelli does help in the defense of the city, but by 1512, so I mean, not that much longer, it surrenders to the Medici, and that could have been the end of Machiavelli. Maybe he would have been not even a footnote in history. Now, but one of the first things that Machiavelli does is lobby this new Medici regime for a position. Now, that doesn't work out. In fact, he's imprisoned. He undergoes 7 rounds of torture. And later, he's able to boast that he didn't break under torture. But upon being released, he is sent into exile. He's in a country retreat where he has to live. Now, he hated exile. Machiavelli is, if anything, a political animal, right?
Yes.
Maybe not in the Aristotelian sense, but he certainly is a political animal, is the way you might think of it.
Yes, right.
And he longed to be in the mix of politics and power. Now, we're told he drank in the company of peasants. He fought with villagers and railed at his fate. And at night, he would don the robes of his old office. He would sit at his desk and write.
What was his escapism, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if
Nowadays, he would have played a video game. He would have played like Assassin's Creed or something.
Don't do it, Machiavelli. Don't play the video game.
Yes.
Read a book instead, or write something.
Right. It's not like you'll destroy the whole course of political philosophy by passing the time that way, right?
Exactly. What would you amount to? I mean, and for us parents, well, we're just plain old exhausted, so we don't have to worry about either one of those possibilities.
Sure.
Okay. So, in any case, one of his works that's produced at this time is his famous Prince. Now, it's actually dedicated to a Medici ruler. And to some extent, some people see this as a treatise. Certainly it is a treatise. Others see it as an extended job application, right? Since he wanted back in power. And others have made the suggestion it's a poison pill. And how so? Well, it's designed to undermine whoever reads it, leading the ruler straight. Now, I'm not at all convinced by that line of interpretation. It's been put forward, but I think that's much less convincing. I think Machiavelli is very keen here to lay out his mode of thought. It's actually a new mode of thought. Just like this is the era of exploration, finding new continents, right? So this is also a discovery of new moral continent, if you like. And we're mixing the Aristotelian word there of continent and so on when it comes to ethics. But this is a new mode of thought, a discovery of new way of being in the world, and by extension, ethics. Now, okay, you want to jump in there?
Well, it's a paradox. It's new and old. Right, it's the Renaissance, right? So in one sense, it's the discovery of new continents and new worlds. In a sense, it's also a rediscovery, right? If you go back to the sources, right, which is part of what he's also doing, and that's why he also has the discourses on Livy. It's also, if we go back, we can find, we can rediscover these truths that have somewhat been lost. And so there's a kind of, it's an interesting, it's both nostalgic and creative. And in fact, one could argue, we'll probably get into this today, certainly when my turn rolls around, we'll talk about this, but some would even suggest he's saying we've got to go back before Christianity came along and wrecked everything, and maybe rediscover some of that pagan virtue. So that's the paradox of the Renaissance that Machiavelli exemplifies. It's new but old, or at least it's perceived of as being a restoration of something old, whether or not it necessarily actually is. Similar to the Reformation, right? Which also which is 5 years later, 1512 and then 1517, you have Luther, right, where it's supposed to be a return to the scriptures and the early church, and also in the same way creating something new, essentially a new church and a new Europe and the Christendom in the process, so. Right,
so the Ad Fontes, which is also part of the humanist movement as well, and this impulse to go back to the sources and so on. And the point is well taken. We don't have to go further than, Thrasymachus, who we just mentioned, in the Republic. So this is not necessarily a new position that Machiavelli is inventing. And you'll see someone, like you mentioned Nietzsche earlier, going back to this old pagan mentality. We're seeing, Christianity as this deviation that ultimately undermines and weakens the West. Now, the Prince does hold that Western civilization, as it's developed, needs to be altered. So, in other words, he's looking to undermine what's come before, and then bring in this modern era. And interesting enough, Machiavelli will we're calling it modern era, but Machiavelli himself calls Christianity modern, as opposed to the ancients, which would be a pagan way of looking at life. Now, in any case, if we want to take stock of what we said so far, we mentioned the word modern. What's different here when Machiavelli starts doing philosophy? Here's one way it can sum up. It's very helpful. Prior to him, thinkers have looked at the world, all right, the cosmos, the human person, the interiority of the heart, and tried to discern how do we fit in to the cosmos? How do we fit into the world? So it's a looking at what's around us, trying to discern or distill how now can we, what's our place in here? Think of it in the scala natura, in the chain of being, or however, whatever your philosophy is. That's usually what we're fitting in. How do we fit in? What happens here is different. This is the market shift. It's looking at the world around us, trying to figure out how it works, not in order to fit into it or find our place in it, but rather how we're going to manipulate it. So the difference now is figure out things in order to gain power over them. Right. Now, the Prince, it's a great read. If we're going to expedite the discussion, though, I think we just skip ahead to chapter 15, which provides a bit of a window into how it's a very lucid, in just several paragraphs, we get great insight into Machiavelli's.
It's probably the heart
reason.
of the book, I would maybe say.
Yeah,
arguably, yeah.
Now, this particular translation is from Jonathan Bennett, but
Okay.
here I'll just read a little bit of it to you, for you, and you can see what how those things go. So he says, and I should give you the. There we go. The title as well. Chapter 15: The things for which men, especially princes, are praised, are blamed. The next topic is how a prince should conduct himself towards his subjects and his friends. Many others have written about this, so I suppose it would seem rash of me to go into it again, especially given the difference between what I shall say and what others have said. So note there already. He is embarking in a new direction. We talked about the Age of Discovery. Well, now he's seen what people said before, and now he's going to do something different.
And just to footnote that this was a genre, right? The Mirror of Princes. Right, this kind of there was a kind of literature where your princes were supposed to read this for practical advice on how to govern and on how to be moral and virtuous. Erasmus wrote one of these. Some people see, Augustine's City of God as being an element of it. I've seen it suggested that even the books of First and Second Kings are a kind of a mirror of princes.
What not
right?
to do? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, sure. And then, to some extent, what to do. Right.
Yeah.
So, in one sense, the Prince just seems like it's another one of a genre. You go to the library. Here's the section on the Mirror of Princes, and here's a book called The Prince by Machiavelli. But of course, what he's saying here is this might look like it's similar to other books in this genre, but I'm really doing something new. And he's right, and he's absolutely right. He is. He's inventing a new kind of genre in a sense.
Yeah. So mind the gap here
Right.
between what others have said and what he's about to tell you right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm not apologetic about this. And he continues on quoting here. My aim is to write things that will be useful for the reader who understands them. So I will find it more appropriate to pursue the real truth of the matter than to repeat what people have imagined about it. Okay, we'll want to take stock here of what he's saying. Now, when he says that, I find it more appropriate to pursue the real truth. Sometimes translations will translate as effectual truth.
That's pretty literal.
Yeah, verita effectual is the term there. Do you have a different translation?
No, that's
okay,
yeah,
sure.
that's effectively. Yeah.
But it's the only time in Renaissance literature that term is used. Right there. And Machiavelli, well, he only uses it once, but no one else uses that term either. And we'll come back to the significance of this redefinition of truth, right, to what is effectual truth, or practical truth. All right, he continues on. Many writers have dreamed up republics and principalities such as never been seen or known in the real world. Now, who do you think?
Who could he be talking about?
I don't know. Well,
Who wrote a book about a republic? I don't know.
An
Kinda
imaginary
reaching
one.
there. Yeah.
And that is a somewhat of a fair critique to Plato in some ways, in that he tried in Syracuse a little bit of experimenting and putting things into practice, and came back with his tail between his legs. And so the question, though, is Plato an idealist with his head in the clouds, which is an ancient critique of Plato, or...
There's literally a play about it.
That's right, yeah.
It's exactly that title.
So, or is this... is there something to idealism? Right? Are ideals real or not? And that's the question of what is real. That's one way of thinking of it. And okay, we continue on here. And attending, I guess before continuing on, this is like Machiavelli. This is him throwing down the gloves, all right? And he's like, this is a hockey speak, I suppose, but dropping the gloves and going out, or laying down the gauntlet, right? And he's coming out
Pretty similar metaphor, really.
Yeah. He's coming out swinging at Plato here. And so he continues on. And attending to them is dangerous because the gap between how men live and how they ought to live is so wide. That's the crack against the jaw there you can hear. So that any prince who thinks in terms not of how people do behave, so again, that's a prince who thinks in terms of ideals and idealism, do behave, but of how they ought to behave, will destroy his power rather than maintaining it. So this is his great battle cry here as he's going up against Plato. Basically, look, hey, if you're going to follow this idealism, you're going to destroy your power. You're going to lose it. You need to actually think of how you ought to behave, not how you not the ideal ruler. Okay, now I'll give you one more sentence maybe here. A man who tries to act virtuously will soon come to grief at the hands of the unscrupulous people surrounding him. All right, so thus a prince, okay, another sentence. Thus a prince who wants to keep his power must learn to act immorally, using or not using his skills, this skill according to necessity. And there's a word necessity as well. Okay, what can we make of this? A number of points. So we mentioned already a redefinition of truth. This is truth coming crashing down to earth, as opposed to being some transcendental reality. Rather, what is true is what's effective, right? What gets results. In other words, what is practical. That's truth. Facts on the ground, my friends. Okay, so we that expression matters of fact. This comes back to Machiavelli.
Yes.
We speak this way still today, or we do talk about facts on the ground. Well, that is from the purview. That's the starting point for Machiavelli. Here also, and this is perhaps needs to be, well, I mean, perhaps you would notice this as well, the bit about acting immorally. He's redefining virtue. Now, in Italian, he's using the word virtù, which sounds a lot like virtue. It's just without an E at the end. But it's a complete redefinition of what the term means. So for Machiavelli, virtù is this cold, calculating, and callous, audacious, and ambitious way of approaching life. So for him, there's Fortuna, or Lady Fortuna. That's all the variables that you can't control. There's so much around us that we have no power over. And what virtue is this manliness where, in a Machiavellian sense of the term, where one is ambitious and audacious, and we take Fortuna and manipulate her the way we want.
Right. Like we're virtue, like vir, like man. There's a virility to this that would make sense. And of course, that's what Fortuna is there for. He doesn't talk about providence, right? It's fortune. It's this changeable woman, right, who seems to be out of our control, except for those who are manly enough to take hold of her and make her do what they need her to do.
Yeah, in this cold and calculated and callous manner. Because, again, he's saying that you have to learn to act immorally. So the virtue, in the classical sense, is out the window. Okay, forget that. That's going to lose you your power. And instead, we need to change gears altogether. Now, in this translation, there's in the next paragraph, there are 11 examples by which he offers here about setting aside fantasies for princes. And here, these are qualities that we're looking for. So,
qualities that bring them praise. Like that's the title of the chapter, right?
Right.
So the important thing here is he's not saying have these qualities because they are intrinsic goods that will broaden your soul and make you magnanimous or holy or something like that. Have these things because they'll have the result of getting you praise. Or at least be perceived to have these things because they'll have the result of getting you praise.
Very good. Because later, he is going to say later on that's exactly it. You don't need to have all these good qualities, but one does need to appear to have them. So, for instance, these qualities, to be merciful, that's point number 3, right? Or trustworthy, point number 4, friendly, straightforward, religious, and so on, right? But he also says you have to be prepared. Okay, so you appear to be trustworthy, you appear to be religious, you appear to be merciful and friendly and so on, and straightforward. But at any given moment, you need to be able to turn those off, right? And turn off. You can switch off any of those virtues, and to suit your purposes. All right. So, okay, let's think about that for a second. What about that point about being religious, right? So, why would I turn that off? Okay, I mean we teach theology as well. What's the problem with being Christian?
I don't know. There's no real inconvenience that comes with it that I can think of. Right.
Yeah. Well, if you're a prince, though, here he's going to say, that's going to make us peaceable, right? And that full reality religion can't be taken on board if that's going to be the destiny of our project. Now, it's interesting. Machiavelli is not really disputing the claims of religion, and metaphysical claims and so on. Rather, what he's worried about are its effects.
Yes.
And why is that? Well, go back to his definition of truth. It's effectual. He's not concerned about the transcendent. He's not concerned about the metaphysical, the realm of the ideals. It's all about the here and now.
Yes.
Right? That what's practical. So it's effects. And so he's not worried about, the theory of it so much, but actions. And here, what's interesting is this is book 15 we've been discussing, but in book 13, he retells the story of David and Goliath.
Yes.
And that is a good one. So I don't know if you remember this, but
sure
right. When David goes out to battle Goliath, what does Machiavelli add here?
He goes out with his 5 smooth stones and his knife.
Right. Now, I think you've mentioned this before, but so maybe I'm getting this from yourself. But I mentioned, maybe this is reference to Goliath's sword or something.
I think
like
he's
that.
being clever. I think he's hedging his bets here for his careful readers, who are going to say, "Wait a minute, there was no knife." Oh well. I think Machiavelli's. The reason he chooses that as his weapon is so he can say, "Well, no, there was." Remember, he takes Goliath's sword and cuts his head off. So I'm not changing the Bible.
Right.
I think he's being sneaky there, and as one might expect of Machiavelli. But of course, what's the implication here? That's still inaccurate. David goes out with 5 smooth stones and the grace of God.
Yeah, trusting in the name of the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely,
That's right.
yes.
And so here, this is Machiavelli showing this is what is needed of a leader, of a political leader like David. It's not the full embrace of religion or trusting in the name of the Lord, but also having, in your other hand, a knife.
Yes.
Right? To lead, to achieve the ends which you are are after. Book 17 is a great line, and I love to ask students this. So maybe I'll ask our listeners right now: is it better to be loved than feared? What do you think? Now, Mr. Fawcett, I'll ask you. What would you say?
Well, I'm going to quote the great philosopher Michael Scott of The Office. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. Fundamentally, it's funny because I actually had an instructor during my Bachelor of Education, because we had a class on philosophy of education. Who's fantastic. Shout out to Dr. Wangler, who would actually quote this to us as a principle of classroom management.
Yes.
He said, you want your students to love you, but at the end of the day, you might not, so they better fear you. That is not a principle I adhere to for parents who are thinking about sending their students to Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center, but it's always stayed with me, that application of Machiavelli.
I still use that in the classroom, actually, but still governs my classroom management. But I mean,
you're a pretty intimidating guy. I can see how you
course.
scare them.
It is, yeah. It's the glasses, right? But in any case, well, it's going back to education. It's always easier to lighten up as the year goes on, or the semester. If you don't come out,
you work your way up to love, but you start with fear. Is that what you're saying, basically?
Something like that. Now, here the cautionary tale that Machiavelli offers us is that of Caesar Borgia, and it too, just like chapter 15, I think sums up much of how Machiavelli looks at the world. And basically, this is a story of the ruler who hires a henchman, essentially, to go about and do his dirty business. As he comes into his fiefdom or his princedom, he needs to establish his authority. And this involves one of his henchmen going out and doing some dastardly deeds to subdue the local population. And as the people catch wind of this, discontentment arises naturally. So, and a horrified reaction to this type of behavior. So people are cowed, but also horrified. They stand in awe, but also revulsion. And so, what is Caesar Borgia's solution? And it is a ritual, very interesting, where he, or we're told at least, that one morning the townspeople arose to find he was in two. Yes. So, in other words, on a public display, almost like at an altar, where So this is a jump ahead here a little bit to Montesquieu, who careful reader of Machiavelli, and he points out that Caesar Borgia is Machiavelli's idol. And what I note is very. We're also told his name is Duke Valentino, and he's the only person mentioned in The Prince who has two names. And why does this lead to? Why is he his idol? Well, who else has two names? None other than Jesus Christ. Right. So this is, according to Montesquieu, at least I'm convinced by this line of reasoning. This is Machiavelli's idol. So Borgia has his own lieutenant ritually murdered in order to, again, invoke the sense of awe of his power.
Well, it's a very clever chess move, right? Because he's got a population that's rising up against him. He has to deal with that, and he has to deal with it violently, but he doesn't want to come across as a violent, oppressive leader. He wants to be loved. So he gets his henchmen to go and put them down as violently as possible. Then when people are horrified, he can also act horrified. I didn't know this guy was going to do that. This will not stand in my administration, so I'm going to saw this henchman in half for his crimes. Now I look like a hero, right, who punishes people who act improperly, but he's achieved the goal he wants. You can see how he influenced Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare talks about the murderous Machiavel, right? How Iago and Edward and other villains in Shakespeare, who Richard III, right, are very much based on Edmund, from King Lear, right? How based on Machiavelli's ideals, right? The chess master villain, right? And is that, I think we'll talk about this more on the next episode, but is this really Machiavelli rewriting the whole, producing his own Bible? Right?
Exactly.
Saying instead of Jesus Christ being his hero, it's going to be Caesar Borgia. There's another clue about that, which we'll talk about later, but that he thinks of it that way, because there's someone else who's given kind of another name. The Pope, who fails him, is called St. Peter.
Okay.
Right, which is sort of an interesting connection too, because of course he is the Pope, so he has that Petrine connection, and the fact of him rewriting the story of David, and even his 11 virtues that a ruler is supposed to be perceived to have had. Okay, there's 11 of them. The first two are he should be seen as free spending, and he should be seen as generous. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are the same thing. Right?
Yeah.
So really, he has 10 commandments for his rulers. Right?
Yes.
Is there something going on there where he's producing a new Bible, that's exactly what you were saying earlier. He's breaking from what came before, all of Christianity, and saying, forget all that transcendental stuff. We need the effectual truth, and here's your Bible for that. Right? It's the Prince,
Absolutely, yeah.
And the fact that earlier on, when he's listing these kind of great examples of leadership from ancient history, he just lists Moses. He just throws Moses in there. Yeah. It's like, well, you can achieve the same thing as Moses did, right? It's like Cyrus and Moses are listed as kind of being on the same level. Yeah. As though it's not really God. He kind of pays lip service and says, Moses had God on his side, but really, if you follow these rules, you'll be like Moses, right? Yeah. That this is the law, right? This is Machiavelli's Torah almost. So you can be like these pagan rulers, or you can be like Moses. It's all really one and the same. Moses is another pre-Christian ruler, by the way. Right. Right. Is that what's going on here? Well, potentially, right? It sure comes off that way.
Yeah.
Right?
And for readers, he's throwing this dichotomy at us, right? So he's especially those who are familiar with the classical world, right? So dichotomy one, we've mentioned this already. Are you going to be idealist or practical? So
isn't it funny, by the way, that today we call that, and we have an episode about this, that's called realism. Right. In the past, realism would have meant you believe in the transcendentals, right?
Right,
You're not
right.
a nominalist. Now, for most people, if you say you're a realist, especially in like a political realm, you mean you're an international realist. It means you're a Machiavellian. It's like the opposite of what it used to mean to be a realist.
Yes.
We discussed that previously, and you can see this as kind of a prequel to our episode on international realism, because that's just applying Machiavelli's thought to not to governing your own population, but to kind of international governance, relations with other people, right?
Well, yes. And epistemologically, also, in terms of realism, now what becomes real? What is real is what's practical,
what works,
what's in front of us. Like, remember we mentioned already the brute facts, right? So that now becomes real. We mentioned this word already, but here's another dichotomy. Are you going to be religious or realist in a Machiavellian sense, right?
Sure, yeah.
So what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to follow? Okay, so that's another dichotomy he throws. And then, are you going to follow a moral code? Are you going to be bound by our moral code, or are you going to have no scruples about switching it on or off when you need to? So, in other words, another dichotomy would be: are you going to follow virtue in the Aristotelian sense of the word? Right, where it leads to a full human flourishing by inculcating habit and striving for excellence moment to moment.
Which is what makes you more political for Aristotle.
That's
what it means
absolutely.
to be political, is to be virtuous, ultimately.
They're all, it's absolutely connected. And not just because humans are political animals, because of the logos, language and thought, so on, binds us together as well. So, but yes. So, are you going to be virtuous in the Aristotelian sense, or are you going to have virtue in the Machiavellian sense?
Are you going to be political in a Machiavellian sense?
Yeah.
Which is funny that nowadays the term political is almost a pejorative.
Right.
Right? Like, this guy, he's just doing it for political reasons. Like, for Aristotle, those are the best reasons you could do something in one sense. Yeah. Nowadays, that's seen as just being kind of calculating, because we think of it in a Machiavellian way of understanding politics as like a chess game.
It's calculated, yeah. And I think it's important to go back maybe to the Aristotelian sense there in some ways. It's not kind of a pet peeve of mine, but almost always when you hear a political opponent attacking another political opponent for some policy, they're saying, "Oh, you're trying to score political points," or "Don't bring politics into this." Well, Aristotle's to point out, hold on a second, what?
right.
This is all about politics. This is like what we eat and breathe. Like this is what it means to be human. In any case,
Pope Francis said the same thing actually when he was accused of being political. He actually said, "Well, Aristotle says that humans are political animals." Yeah,
okay.
He's like, I don't see that as an insult, So
of course not. Yeah, I mean that's what we do. Okay, now. Let's just maybe try and sum up some of this, or let's highlight some key points from Machiavelli, some takeaways. So again, we mentioned effectual truth or verita effectuelli. So it can also be translated as real truth. So again, what does it mean? The truth of a thing is in its effect, right? So in other words, truth is not abstract. It's not theoretical. Again, it's not related to the idios or the forms like in Plato or the ideal, but it's rooted in action, results. Okay. Now, again, the implication here, what's the takeaway? Don't listen to what anyone says, or don't listen to what groups believe. Watch what they do. Okay, and there could be certainly some logic to that. I mean, Jesus does say you'll know them by their fruits, and certainly he says, you can say Lord, Lord all you want, but what matters is what you do. So, but in any case, that's one implication of this redefinition of truth. It's results, right? It's effects. That's all we're looking at. Now, what are the anthropological implications? By that I just mean how we look at each other, how we look at other humans. Well, here it's a reversal of Plato's pyramid of the soul, that tripartite view of the soul, with at top is the the nous rather, which that's the seat of reason, which deals with the abstract, with ideals and so on. That's not the lens for understanding humanity, right, or how we should behave. Rather, it's the appetites as well as the thumos. That's what we need to consider the most, since these are what push or pull us according to effectual truth. Now, what's the takeaway here when it comes to our relationships? Now, we read our relationships according to not the theory, but the results. Now, consider this utterance. If I say to my wife, I love you, right? Effectual truth is going to translate it as, what do you want from me? Okay, right? And why that translation, right? Again, because effectual truth, it hones in on what pushes or pulls us, as opposed to any ideal or theory or something abstract. Now, what are the implications for science, the development of science? Which is natural sciences or natural philosophy is there, but it's still gaining ground after Machiavelli. Well, effectual truth will accentuate Aristotle's material and certainly efficient causes. So Aristotle has 4 causes, whereas the other 2, so it's the material and efficient that get accentuated. The other 2, formal and final, they're largely left out of the investigation. Now, what are the advantages of that? Well, in some ways, this new approach gives us a better understanding of matter, the cause and effects of what's happening, and the why, right? In the physical world, it leads to great leaps of innovation and technology. What's the disadvantage of dropping the formal and final causes of Aristotle, right? Well, one, I'll just highlight one, is reductionism. Now, what do we mean by reductionism? Well, we reduce our understanding of reality to just one perspective, right, or one element. In other words, the material or efficient cause. So that's one draw. Here's another one. Society. So not only, and we see this in science, it really just focuses on those 2 causes, the material and efficient. But another drawback is a gradual veering towards scientism or empiricism, and that's basically the idea like, well, I'll believe it's true if science can prove it's true, right? Or to say love is just a chemical produced in your brain, or thoughts or free will. Well, that's just a result of your nerves firing and so on.
And there's a reduction there with, the concept of political science, right? In saying that politics, by virtue of being a science, doesn't deal with morality, right? That's an impoverishment of politics, but it's also an impoverishment of science, which in some ways is a negative outcome of the Renaissance. Is that there's a discovery of science, there's an explosion, right? There's the age of discovery, as it were, and yet in a strange way that also narrows it so much. Because as opposed to in the Middle Ages, where it was seen as so rich with kind of symbolism, and it was Platonic as well, right? These were forms that participated in the eternal logos, right? With the breadth of scientific knowledge, there's also a thinning out. The significance of it isn't there, and in fact, it's interesting. Pope Benedict quoted this one German scientist as saying that in some ways the Galileo affair is the origin of nuclear bombs, because that kicks off the way of thinking of, science has nothing to do with religion, therefore it has nothing to do with morality. So just, like wherever it goes, you know what I mean, right? Like whatever we can come up with, why not? Which is very useful, say, to a prince.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Who wants to develop dynamite or weapons or something like this.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, like I said, originally the genre of the Mirror for Princes, it was something that was written for both kind of practical and moral instruction. Well, those weren't even seen as different, really, right, for a prince.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was training in virtue, right? Now it becomes, there's morality, you need to know about that, but really, ultimately, it's administration is a kind of science, right, that you can perfect, right? Yeah. It's a technocracy, almost.
Right.
Whether that's in a corporate sphere, and of course this is kind of the beginning of capitalism around here too,
yes.
or in the political sphere with the the city-state becoming the nation-state ultimately, right? There's a that view of science and of politics as science in that sense is having this pervasive effect in all these different areas as this new world is born. Let's say, this truly modern world, you could say,
Yeah, and so taking it from, say, like political science to the discipline of science. Well, how about something very practical to all of us? To use that word, human affairs, our relationships, right? So to come back to that, again, effective truth is reducing the sum of human affairs. Whenever I'm interacting with others, at the back of my mind is, what's in it for me, right? Or what can I get out of this situation or this arrangement? How does it benefit me, right? So that calculating aspect is always got to be in the background. What's the calculus? Now, what are some implications now for any would-be or potential prince out there? We will have some listeners. All right. Well, here's one. Be dependent on no one.
Yeah.
Right? And for Machiavelli, it's be a uno solo. And I always tell my students, you got to pronounce that with a Java slur. But
do you think Han Solo starts off as a
uno solo?
Machiavellian figure?
100%. Yeah.
Yes.
Throughout the first, 85, 90% of A New Hope, he's living it out. Right? He's the uno solo. Right? And don't be dependent on anyone. And so whether it's
I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen any evidence of a force.
Right. Yes.
Right.
You could go through all those quotes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see for Machiavelli, don't be dependent on nobles or peoples or Lady Fortuna. Right now, okay. Some people are probably listening, saying, "Hey, sign me up. How do I become a uno solo? Right? And do I get a beastly sidekick and my own ship, perhaps?
Sure.
Right.
A pure, which is, if we want to go down this road, right? Han Solo's companion is a pure brute, animalistic, element, right? That kind of becomes civilized alongside him, right? As the story goes on, as he's pulled out of himself. Right?
And when push comes to shove, right? What's Solo doing when they need him the most? He's leaving with his gold, so to speak, right? He's packing it up onto his ship and he's going with his credits. That's what he's doing. So what's he left with at the end of the day? A metal ship, all right, a tin can, and this beastly sidekick. So in other words, when you sign up to become an uno solo, what are you left with at the end of the day? Well, you're left with your virtue alone. Okay, so now that might sound lonely. Well, it gets worse. All right. So what are the implications of effectual truth when it comes to something like freedom? Let's think about that for a second. Who is the freest human? Now, on Machiavelli, the implications of effectual truth is this. Only the most powerful, so only a tyrant, really, is free. So the tyrant is the freest. Now, why? You might ask that. Why? Because the most powerful doesn't rely on anyone else. Right? So, in fact, now, paradoxically, now think about this, freedom is rooted where? In the tyrant. Okay? So he or she is a rock, right? An island of power. That's where you end up. That's where you end up with freedom. Now, let's think about this even a little bit further. What about how do we view God now and freedom? Well, an uno solo, can't live in the same town as God. And why not? Well, because God now is seen as a competitor, right? If God is free and powerful, then his freedom and power necessarily impinge on mine and vice versa. So there isn't room in the town for the two of us.
That's right, yeah.
And anyway, this is if you recall Jean-Paul Sartre's reason for atheism.
Yes.
It's following this line of thought, right?
Which it has nothing ultimately to do with arguments for or against God's existence. It's effectual. If there's a God, I can't be free. Therefore, I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Who cares about the argument from contingency or whatever? I'm an uno solo, or I want to be one. Right? So for that reason, I'm not going to believe in God, or I'm going to be a practical atheist. Right? Because again, it's just bracketing that whole area out of metaphysics, really, for the sake of my own ego. Right?
Right. Now, how will I respond to that? Right. So how am I respond to that argument? Well, here's one way. Is to say, well, God is ineffable, right? So in other words, God is not another being, right? In a long list, even if he's supreme, right? So in other words, he's not in competition with us. For Augustine, he's id ipsum, which this is the thrice holy name of God he mentions in the Confessions. Id ipsum. So just like he's holy, holy, holy. And this can be translated a few ways. Some translators put it as the self-same, self-same being or being itself. Regardless, here God is not just, in classical theism, he's not just another being, right? So he's not in competition with us in that sense.
This is where the doctrine of analogy comes in. It's very important, as opposed to univocity, right, where God's just like made of the same stuff as us, and therefore, if he takes up space that we can't take up, like no, it's his existence is actually analogical to ours. You have to think of it in a whole different way. To the extent we can't think of it, which is the point of apophatic theology. But topic for another day. But very important.
Now here's another response. Without God, there is no freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So free will can only exist if it has a transcendent source. Try as you may. You can look at all the molecular structure of a human being. You're not going to find a free will molecule anywhere. So it's not a material thing. Right. Okay.
Well, there's two layers to this. When you say that you can't have freedom without God, I think there's two different ways you could interpret that. Again, I'll pick up on this, I think, on our next episode. But in one, first of all, intellectually, it doesn't make any sense for the reason you've mentioned. If there's not God, or at least something transcendent, there's no way that we cannot just be completely deterministic. Like you say you're conquering Lady Fortuna all you want. You're made of chemicals that are just, your choices are either completely determined or there's just some randomness. There's some kind of quantum randomness that's happening. But there's no freedom. For you to have free will, you have to have, Kant, to his credit, recognized this, right? You can't get freedom out of just the mechanistic, materialistic world. You have to believe in something else. There's also this question of, like, in terms of your freedom from the passions. Right, if you really want to be free, like in the sense of self-governing, and as someone named Plato came up with this and realized this, you actually need you need self-denial in service of something transcendent. Otherwise, if you just pursue what you want, eventually you will be enslaved by it. That's been a pretty universal experience. And ultimately, most of them would say you need God. Both, you need to believe in him and aspire after him. Ultimately, you need his grace. Otherwise, you don't have the true freedom that comes, from truth and ultimately from Christ. You just have a kind of slavery, an uninhibited slavery is all that kind of freedom is. So in multiple ways, you actually need God to be free.
Absolutely, freedom from the passions and freedom. And this is one reason I would avoid the word autonomy, because it's auto, meaning self, nomos, law, right? So it's as if you're self-creating your own law, which is a very Nietzschean way of looking at things. And if you read Dostoevsky, you'll see the path that will go down if you try to create your own value and your own become your own God. And to add to that, or to Plato at least, is the Augustinian way of looking at it, is that God, not only liberation from our passions, but it authenticates our freedom by drawing us into Holy Communion. So if you put it another way, God is not an uno solo, right? But a Trinity,
right?
A tripersonal communion of love. Beloved and lover, right? And so this is in freedom. God calls us not to become an uno solo, right, ourselves, but calls us to be in communion with Him, right? And there we find our true freedom.
Which is why Aristotle says we're political animals. And Aquinas picks up on this. You actually are yourself. You're free to be yourself in community. Rightly ordered community, like beginning with the family and then ultimately in friendship and in society, like that actually allows you to become what you are as a human being, as a person, as a political animal, and then you actually have a whole lot of freedom that you wouldn't have if you were, let's say, like a feral wolf child or something like that, right? Yeah. So to being political in that traditional sense, not being an uno solo, is actually like what frees us up, by communion and in a community and in some sense self-gift and self-denial. For the sake of the other.
Right. Yeah, self-gift, I like that. Which is the act of kenosis and love, right? And imitating God in that fullest sense, or the highest sense at least. Now, I guess, again, what are the implications for humanity if we adopt Machiavelli's false god, right? Caesar Borgia as our idol, or if we become a duco, count, or an uno solo, right?
He kind of looked like the traditional pictures of Jesus too. Actually, I think it kind of bolsters Montesquieu's thesis.
Sure.
If you look at Caesar Borgia, he kind of looks like the traditional, white brunette Jesus.
Okay.
He's got that beard. So
right.
Yeah, he's quite the Antichrist figure for sure. So
well, and again, the implications are we're left in a state of acquiring. Right, which is it was not well. I mean, as Augustine points out, our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, O Lord. Right. So this is what we're left with: a state of acquiring that cannot be satisfied. So we can be acquisitive with power. We'll leave this for another day when it comes to the economic realm, because that's a different extrapolation of what the Prince is talking about. But certainly that is a takeaway. And really, wanting more. Whether it's power or some material goods, or in the political sense wanting more power, this governs all relationships. So if we wrap this up and bring it back to the discussion of justice, well, here we have a complete redefinition of what virtue is, right? A virtue. And with this redefinition, so goes justice as an ideal, right? So in other words, justice which envelops, as you were talking, mentioning there, the individual, the polis or the society, the city, by extension the cosmos, and then further our extension to the divine. So this is the direction Machiavelli leads us, and I know we're running short on time here, but I don't know. Do you want to throw anything else out?
No, just that I was thinking in terms of speaking of Aristotle, his student. How do I say? Hell in some sense, is God giving us what we ask for, right? And I was thinking about, supposing you really wanted to be an uno solo, you'd end up like Alexander the Great, right?
Okay, how so?
Well, he conquers the world, and then he's found weeping in his tent because he has no worlds left to conquer. Right? Like if you really could achieve this, if you could be the emperor, right, from Star Wars and end up controlling the whole world. First of all, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. You'd be like the emperor and Darth Vader are secretly jockeying against each other. But even supposing you had, absolute confidence that you would attain all the power in the world in the sense of power that Machiavelli is talking about, your heart would still be restless, right? Ultimately, you'd realize like there's nothing left. I've got everything. There are no worlds left for me. Not in this world. For me to conquer, and ultimately you'd be left kind of broken. You'd be left empty. You'd be left unsatisfied, grasping, and curved in on yourself, like Augustine says about sin. So it's what a curse to be an uno solo. What a curse to be a successful Machiavellian tyrant. If such a thing were possible, which in this world it's not, but if it could be, my goodness, what a curse that would really be.
Which is, I think, one reason why we love Han Solo. Because he breaks out of the curse, right? Right. So
he gives into the Force, right?
Well, he lays his life on the line in the end. At least, in A New Hope, right? So
in A New Hope, it'd be a shame if some subsequent movies were to undo the whole effect of that ending.
Well, I like that.
Fortunately, that has never happened. Not in the canon. Well, I have really enjoyed this. It's great to be back in the saddle
in
here,
the chair,
in our trademark chair. So next time we speak, I'm going to build on what you've said. I'm going to kind of discuss this question of basically, is Machiavelli a Christian? I will argue that there are ways in which his thought is Christian. I'll just tease one of them right now really quickly.
Okay.
Is that I think he does improve on Plato in recognizing human depravity. Right? I think that is a Christian insight that he has, that Plato, like you mentioned, when Plato road-tested his ideas, he kind of hit a brick wall, and I think actually Machiavelli, Peter Crave says this too, like, benefited from being post-Augustinian and kind of recognizing the fact that people are sinful and fallen. And a little bit then about, he's trying to give you a practical guide to the world. Is it? Does his advice actually work?
Sure. Okay.
And we'll discuss this perhaps tomorrow.
You have a lot of convincing to do here. I'm a bit skeptical, but I'm open to ideas.
All right. I'm going to say because we're talking about this because I think he's like I said, he invented a whole genre of books you will still find: self-help books, corporate management books. They're all kind of the brainchild of our friend Machiavelli. So we'll talk about that next time. But for now, that's my last thought. I'll let you close with any final thoughts and with prayer.
Well, let's close with a prayer.
All right,
in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. You, O Lord, are holy, magnificent, you who reign above. You have called us to yourself. You've called our hearts to rest in you who are immutable, you who sent into this world in the fullness of time your Son to draw us into your marvelous light. We pray, Father, for your Holy Spirit to be sent once again into our hearts, that we may love you more deeply and serve you more faithfully. For you give us the model of Christ. May you help us to imitate him, your Son, and in turn be made as sons and daughters of the Most High. And we make this prayer through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.